So, schönen guten Abend, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Gäste, volles Haus, das freut uns sehr. Ich darf euch ganz herzlich bei uns hier im Karl-Renner-Institut zu unserer Buchpräsentation willkommen heißen. Mein Name ist Sebastian Schublach und ich darf durch den Abend führen. Wir präsentieren heute Österreich Premiere, die deutschsprachige Ausgabe des Buchs Muskismus, Aufstieg und Herrschaft eines Technoking. Verfasst haben dieses hochaktuelle Buch zwei Autoren mit ganz unterschiedlichen Hintergründen. Der eine ist Historiker, der andere Technologiejournalist. Gemeinsam haben sie nicht nur das Interesse an Elon Musk, sondern auch, dass sie heute Abend hier zu Gast in Wien sind. Bitte begrüßen Sie mit mir Quinn Slobodian und Ben Tarnoff. Dear Quinn, dear Ben, a very warm welcome to Vienna. Quinn Slobodian is Professor of International History at Boston University and widely known for his acclaimed books like Globalists, Crack Up Capitalism, and his latest book, Hayek's Bastards, The Neoliberal Roots of the Populist Right, was about a history of the intellectual origins of the alt-right. Ben Tarnoff, you are a renowned tech journalist and writer, and your works appear in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the New York Review of Books. You are also an author. You wrote the book Internet for the People, and you are a co-author of the book Voices from the Valley. Tech workers talk about what they do and how they do it. We are absolutely thrilled and honored to have you here tonight. Diese Analyse des Muskismus aber auch in unsere europäische, österreichische politische Realität zu übersetzen, freue ich mich ganz besonders auf unsere dritte Mitdiskutantin. Sie ist Politikwissenschaftlerin, selbst Bestseller-Autorin und eine der profiliertesten Expertinnen Österreichs für Rechtsextremismus sowie vor allem für die Radikalisierung von Rechten und Konservativen. Herzlich willkommen, Natascha Strobl. Ganz kurz zum Ablauf. Wir starten mit einer Vorstellung der zentralen Thesen und Ideen und Punkte durch Quinn Slobodian und Ben Tarnoff. Danach sprechen wir gemeinsam hier hinten auf der Bühne über das Buch und haben einige Fragen, die wir dann noch nachschießen. Aber dann freuen wir uns natürlich auch auf Ihre Kommentare, Ihre Fragen aus dem Publikum. Im Anschluss an die Diskussion, an die Veranstaltung gibt es auch einen Büchertisch und es gibt auch die Möglichkeit, die Bücher gleich zu signieren zu lassen. Das finden Sie dann hinten im Seminarraum und meine Kolleginnen und Kollegen haben auch dementsprechend Schilder vorbereitet. Genug jetzt von meiner Seite. Das ist auch der einzige Teil, der heute auf Deutsch stattfindet, weil wir das deutschsprachige Buch vorstellen, aber die Veranstaltung selbst findet auf Englisch statt. Ich darf jetzt ganz herzlich Quinn Slobodian und Ben Tarnoff um ihren Vortrag bitten. Ben and Quinn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sebastian, to advance the slide. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sebastian. Thank you also to Natascha for joining us. Thank all of you for coming. It's extraordinarily full room. We're very grateful to be here with all of you. We're going to begin with about a 20-minute presentation of the book. It's going to be kind of a lightning tour of the theme. So I apologize in advance if it's a bit overwhelming or kind of just throw a bunch of ideas out that we cover more extensively in the book and may get into greater detail in the course of our conversation. But just think of it as a kind of chaotic tapas meal of Muskism. It's kind of a horrifying, sorry, Quinn made a face. I apologize for that metaphor. There goes, can you hear me? Let's start maybe just with the title, Muskism. What do we mean by that? Just kind of a note on method before we descend into some of the themes of Muskism. We came to the word Muskism through the following thought experiment. Commentators of the last century came up with, I think we might be going in and out. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up? Okay. Commentators of the last century came up with a term called Fordism, which you might be familiar with. It gained popularity in particular among social scientists in the 1970s. And Fordism was a concept that they derived by looking at the life and the work of the famous industrialist Henry Ford. Fordism was not a term Ford himself used. He did not consider himself a Fordist, someone who was systematically implementing a worldview, but theorists and observers of various kinds found the materials for a system called Fordism in his life and work and written statements. They extrapolated, interpreted a set of themes from the materials of Ford's own career. We take the same approach with Musk. We're not saying that Musk is a consistent actor or a premeditated one, much less one who's motivated primarily by a set of ideas. But rather what we're saying is that if you step back and look at the career and the life of Musk as a whole, there are certain themes, certain leitmotifs, certain recurring preoccupations that we can extrapolate into a political economic paradigm that we describe as Muskism. And further, that the virtue of this is that it helps us understand not just something about Musk, but I think more importantly and maybe more usefully, something about the last 40 years of global capitalism, and in particular the strange era that we find ourselves in right now in the 2020s. What we're really aspiring to do with the book is to provide an alternative history of how we got here. So with that out of the way, I'm looking at my timer because I'm going to try to keep my remarks to 10 minutes before handing it off to Quinn. I'm going to give you a quite accelerated overview of the first half of the book, and hopefully the slides will move forward. Okay. Oh, that's another title card, so let's move again. Our first chapter of the book is called Fortress Futurism, and this takes up Musk's childhood in late apartheid South Africa. Despite our interest in thinking about Muskism as a kind of broader worldview, the book itself follows the passages of Musk's life in order to kind of excavate the themes of Muskism as they emerge and evolve over the decades. And the main theme of this chapter, and one that I'll dwell on maybe a little bit longer, the others I might go by a bit quickly because I think it's particularly important, is Fortress Futurism. What is Fortress Futurism? It's the belief that technology can strengthen self-reliance in a hostile and unstable world. And we trace the origins of this kind of thinking to apartheid South Africa, which we remember, of course, as a white supremacist state, but also a state that saw economic self-sufficiency and high technology as integral to its survival. So the regime's leaders perceive threats both externally and internally, and the way that they can garrison themselves against these threats is by trying to bring the production of things like automobiles within the borders of the country, but also to accelerate technological development. For instance, in the case of the South African nuclear program, they successfully built an operational bomb by the early 1980s. And why this? We're back. This experience was significant for us is that, that might be better. How's that? Okay, I think that's more comfortable for me too. Is that one of the things that distinguishes Musk at his companies, particularly at SpaceX and Tesla, is his early emphasis on vertical integration. If you know anything about Musk as a businessman, you might know this, that as early as the 2000s, when other American industrialists are spinning global supply chains around the world in the search of lower labor costs, he is trying to concentrate production as much as possible within the walls of the firm, reducing his reliance on external suppliers. And we find quite a lot of resonance with that and the South African political economic model of, in particular, the late apartheid period. So skipping right along, the second chapter moves to Musk's career in Silicon Valley. So there's kind of an interlude between South Africa and Silicon Valley, but by 1995, Musk has arrived in the Valley just as the dot-com boom is popping off. And this is where Musk makes his first millions. It's where he acquires the wealth that he uses to go on and found SpaceX in 2002 and to become the chief investor of Tesla in 2004. And here we're really interested in two themes. One is what we call state symbiosis. Our argument is that Musk is not a libertarian. He's not someone who seeks to shrink the state or to exit from the state, but rather to fuse with the state, to instrumentalize the state as a source of power and profit, but also, more importantly, to become a service provider to the state in facilitating the exercise of sovereign functions. So one sentence we use to summarize this theme is that Muskism is about increasing state capacity through private means. The other theme that we discuss in this chapter is the idea of the superset, which gives the chapter its title. And this term actually comes from an interview that Musk did in his late 20s in 1998, where he describes the internet as the superset of all media. If you've heard of Mark Andreessen's phrase from some years later that software is eating the world, the internet superset is an early version of that same idea. It suggests that the entire human reality will be networked and digitized, and therefore those who control the code, those who control the networks, will possess ultimate power. And this is an idea that we want to identify as having early origins because it returns quite powerfully in the material that Quinn will describe for you in just a moment. Moving right along, the next chapter is Sovereignty as a Service. This looks at his experience founding and developing SpaceX in 2002 and afterwards. This is an area where that dynamic of state symbiosis that I described can be most clearly and radically seen. To give you a statistic, by 2025, SpaceX was responsible for 95% of all US orbital launches and about half of all launches globally. So SpaceX has essentially become the de facto gatekeeper for US government access to low Earth orbit, and that is quite critical, as we know, not just for civilian communications, but for modern warfare. The role of Starlink in the guidance of drones, for instance, I think has been demonstrated amply in the Ukrainian conflict. In the case of SpaceX, what we observe is that the state, through this symbiotic relationship, has ceded its sovereignty to private actors to such a degree that it is forced to buy it back in increments from a corporation. And that's a dynamic that we call sovereignty as a service. I'm going to be zooming through the last piece of this, which is electric autonomy. And this is the chapter that deals with Tesla. Now, Tesla, just to periodize this for you briefly, Musk does not found Tesla, but he comes on board in 2004 as its largest investor and its chairman. He then takes over as CEO in 2008. And our argument is that from the beginning, Tesla is not really about selling cars so much as it is the selling of the promise of electric autonomy, which is the notion that renewable energy can strengthen self-reliance. And I think, we're giving this talk as the war on Iran by U.S. and Israel is continuing. And I think this is actually a quite apt illustration of the value of electric autonomy, which is a value that Musk himself was very involved in selling and is really the basis for Tesla's early success and its ability to obtain, in particular, a large loan from the Department of Energy under Obama in 2009, which is the notion that by investing in renewables, you can reduce your exposure to external shocks, in particular those that relate to conflict in the Middle East. Right, and this is obviously a major motivation for the Chinese in their build-out of renewable energy, that it's about national sovereignty. And this is a promise that Musk has repeatedly made and monetized over the years. That's a lot of ground that I've covered very quickly. I hope some of it made sense. I'm going to turn it over to Quinn, and he's going to give you a brief sketch of the final portion of the book.
Yeah, thanks also from my side for everybody for coming. I realize there's like a big apparatus blocking the right-hand side, so I'll try to move around a little bit more. And so maybe I'll even just be the professor that I am and just stand on the stage and say hello to class. I wanted to maybe just go back to the beginning very quickly. Ben set this up extremely well, but I wanted to remind the audience one of the things that I think we were doing with the book as well, which is to kind of try to provide an alternative history of the last 25 or 30 years. As a historian doing this kind of stuff in front of classes of students, trying to explain the last 35 or 40 years, there often tends to be a kind of rather overly disjunctive narrative about where we came from. There was a Cold War that ended in 1989. That was followed by an era of high globalization. And then sometime around 2016, the whole thing came to a halt, and there was a return to nationalism and something like deglobalization as the pendulum swang back from interdependence. Often one wonders how we got from point A to point B. What were the seeds? What were the precedents? Who were the prescient thinkers who were sort of foreshadowing the different moments that came later? One of the arguments we're making in Muskism is that Elon Musk helps us see the way that the next paradigm is always being incubated in the one that precedes it. What you're looking at here is the Pelindaba nuclear reactor in South Africa. So this is an example of what Ben was describing, how they were using high tech to build out national hardening, national self-sufficiency in a time when South Africa saw itself facing enemies on the left, on the right, and from within. So even there, late Cold War, it's not just a question of American-style globalization versus Soviet-style planning. There's a third option, which is the South African option of being plugged into global markets, but at the same time trying to deepen your capacity for national protection and national self-reliance. We think this is something that Musk brought with him. This image here is the Commodore keyboard programmable computer, one of the first personal home computers that you could buy at a relatively low consumer cost that Musk acquires in a Johannesburg shopping mall in the late 1980s, and immediately uses as a kind of portal to another realm, another layer of reality as he saw it. We argue that this world in a box, as he saw it, was the beginning of what became second nature to Musk, which is the idea that the online reality is actually primary and everything that is offline is actually derivative of what's happening inside of this world in a box, that critically he has the ability to program, he has the ability to have a total overview over. The image here is of the networked battlefield. So Ben referred to SpaceX and its very important satellite product, Starlink, which came in the context of the war on terror, and specifically Donald Rumsfeld's vision of the networked battlefield, which because of GPS, itself a state product, now made possible a much lighter footprint of troops on the ground, boots on the ground in the battlefield, the use of special forces, the use of sort of virtual creations of the battlefield itself, all dependent on a grid of low Earth orbit satellites, which Musk was then able to provide. So he gets his entry there by saying the state needs something, here it is, I'm making it for you. This image, just in case you're wondering why it's up here, is the cover of the last annual report from Tesla, the last master plan that they published. It's not a car, it's a humanoid robot, because, as you're probably all aware, Musk took a rather large reputational hit through his wild activities in the last year, and Tesla stock is Tesla sales are plummeting worldwide. 30% fewer Teslas sold last year in the EU than the year before. In response to that, Musk emphasizes again that he's not in the car business. Tesla is not a car company. Tesla is selling what he calls the ecosystem. The ecosystem includes an automobile, more likely a Cybertruck than a Model Y, but it also includes a solar roof, it includes a Starlink receiver, it includes a power wall for excess power storage, and it includes, and he promises within 10 years, your own personal humanoid robot that will be able to, relieve you of all domestic labor. So you've now fortified the home at the individual level, produced in electric autonomy, unplugged from the unreliable public grid in a time of increasing social unrest, increasing climate catastrophe. And this, we argue, is the one of the promises that Muskism makes. So this is the first half of our book, really, is called Foundation, with a nod to his interest in Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. And it's really focused on the material. How did he, instead of going to make a so-called burrito delivery app or another social media company that was just getting you addicted to posting online and then taking your privacy, your personal data, and selling it on to advertising agencies, Musk was actually like shaping metal and steel in a time when most people were just trying to tweak the algorithm. Nevertheless, the second half of the book dives into that digital world because we think that you can't explain what happened to Musk when Musk went crazy in the terms of the bumper sticker without understanding how he has realized his great wealth and has become a very important symptom, really, of our excessive reliance on the form of digital capitalism through his immersion in engagement with the online world itself. The image you can see here is one that he posted himself of Musk holding up the Shiba Inu dog, right? It's a kind of détourned image from The Lion King, but it's important not only because it strangely prefigured his Doge initiative later, but because it was through posting, through tweeting, that Musk realized the power of what we call attention alchemy. He discovered specifically by taking this joke crypto coin called Dogecoin. It was actually an attempt to make fun of crypto, the Dogecoin. He could just post buy Doge, and suddenly the value of Doge went vertical. He could do the same things with his own companies. He could say, we're taking Tesla private at $4.20 a share, and the price went vertical. He had this disintermediated relationship to the global investor class that no capitalist in history has ever had before, right? So Ford could write books, he could buy the Dearborn Independent, publish his anti-Semitic tracts. He couldn't wake up in the middle of the night, in his underwear and write out 2 words on his phone and change global markets the next morning. Musk realized that he had that power, so in short, he wasn't wasting his time on the internet the way it's often assumed. He was a Twitter addict, he was going nuts, he was depressed, he was drug addicted, whatever was happening. We argue that he was kind of learning how you could transform precisely those online viral and mimetic dynamics into value creation in the real world. So that then becomes made rather more concrete in his vision of how this can be operationalized as a way to, as he calls it, increase our connection with the giant cybernetic collectives, quote unquote, a term from him, that we are all becoming, willy-nilly through our engagement with the internet, through our engagement with our devices. We are, he said, becoming giant cyborgs. And to deny that is to deny the prominence of digitization in everyday life, and arguably is to deny the real engine of global political economy in the early 21st century, which is a handful of big tech firms, which, to remind you, a couple of which account for the entire value of the entire DAX. A couple more are equivalent to the value of the entire London Stock Exchange. The disproportionate importance of these tech firms, right, cannot be exaggerated. So Musk said, why stop? Let's go harder. How can we go harder? Brain-computer interfaces that allow our bandwidth between ourselves and our devices to expand from just our eyeballs and our fingers into the great rushing river possible through actual brain implants being put into the head. So far, the Neuralink has only been used on people with disabilities and paralysis, but he said again and again, the value proposition of Neuralink is that everyone will have them. Everyone will have them because he thinks and thought that the only way for us to fend off being ultimately destroyed by the alien superintelligence that we're building online is to get out ahead of it and make sure that we are collectively a better AI through our own immersion in the world of the cyborg collective. The story changes for Musk, though, in ways that become memorable to everybody here when he starts to worry about something happening in the networked interface between our brains and our computers and our devices. Around 2020, with the pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Me Too movement against sexual harassment and rape in the workplace, against the unregulated power of big tech with the Biden proposal to regulate AI, to break up digital monopolies, Musk starts to think that something has happened in the cybernetic collective. He starts to think it has been infected with what he calls the woke mind virus, a term that it took me and Ben a long time to take seriously because it sounds so stupid that with many of the things Musk says, you're tempted to dismiss it and see it as just like a bad joke or a dismissible metaphor. But what we came to realize is that by adopting this term mind virus, which comes from Richard Dawkins, fusing it onto the idea of the meme, which also comes from Richard Dawkins, we can understand how he sees now the digital interface as a space that is the primary site of politics, and that to create politics that will ensure the reproduction of his own self-interest and those of the Silicon Valley sector at large, he will need to take control of the means of meme production and the platforms upon which the mind viruses spread and propagate. So the purchase of Twitter in 2022, the rollout of XAI, the creation of Grok, the creation of Grokopedia after that is an attempt for him to create an engine that produces the kind of mimetic politics that he feels is necessary to fend off the dangers of progressivism and the dangers of wokeism. So if you follow his thinking, as we were then forced to do and we reconstruct in the book, then you realize he sees that cyber layer as really the battlefield, as he has since he was a teenager, and that politics, as explored in the case of the Doge moment, the Doge experience, is just one more site in the world of networked nodes. The state is, as he said at the beginning of Doge, just a bunch of computers. The question that one might have about legitimacy, consent, participation, democracy are simply category errors for him. They don't fit into the engineer's mind. This is an image that he posted at the beginning of the Doge initiative that includes, you can see it maybe slightly, one of these big curved monitors that's specifically used for gaming. And up there, a picture of Pepe the Frog in the Roman garb as a stand-in for his character that he uses on online video games called Cecius Maximus. So as he's gutting the US government, as he's integrating the systems to make them better for purposes of locating immigrants who he sees as viruses in the flesh that need to be removed from the system, he's literally simultaneously toggling between that and playing games that involve him as a kind of cyber elf running through dungeons and slaying as many people as possible, and then posting on X about how he is doing this for the US government. He is speed running a dungeon crawling game rather than actually engaging in something like the transformation of American democracy, which of course he actually was. So that's, where we end up by the end of the book is kind of a troubling vision where we, especially now, see him seeking to make himself structurally indispensable. He currently has 10,000 satellites in orbit. That's 70% of the satellites in the sky. He just put in a request with the US government for 1 million low Earth orbit satellites. Right now, he is, as Ben said, the gatekeeper for access to low Earth orbit. So space sovereignty is de facto becoming something that he has access to the choke point over. Recently, it was mentioned that Austria wanted to launch a satellite of its own and they had to use a SpaceX rocket because he's managed to pull off the trick that we described at the beginning, promise sovereignty through technology, and then create new forms of dependency on himself alone. So that's the world of Muskism that we end up in, and happy to have a conversation with you all about it now.
We will get rid of that. Okay. Kurze Umbauphase.
Hola, knapp was.
Kurze dramaturgische Pause. Thank you, Quinn. Thank you, Ben, for this brief presentation. I mean, it's a very, very condensed version of your book. And what you've done is you've painted a picture of the system called Muskism, where capitalism, tech power, and right-wing narratives merge into something rather dangerous in my perspective. And to help us decode the political and ideological dangers of the system here in Europe as well as in the US, I'm happy to welcome our third panelist, Natascha. Natascha, you have already read the book, and may I ask you for your thoughts on that, for your takes, maybe additional remarks. Or to use a question from the book, what is Musk a symptom of? Einmal drücken.
So, okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for writing the book and being here tonight. And thank you for the conversation we're going to have tonight. When we talk about Elon Musk, it's very tempting, as you said, to talk about personality, eccentric billionaire, brilliant engineer, provocateur. But I think one of the greatest values your book has is that it shifts the focus away from personality and towards structure. Because Musk is not just an individual actor. He may be the most prominent one, he may be the most important one, but he is a product, as you said, of a very specific political and economic environment. And he's also helping reshaping it. And what I find particularly interesting is that Musk embodies a transformation of how power operates in contemporary capitalism. So we're also seeing a transformation of capitalism itself. As you said, in the 20th century, economic power and political power were formally separated. Of course, there was always the influence, of course, there was a strong connection, but it was separated. But what we are now seeing is that business leaders become state actors. They are not behaving as business leaders who are influencing state actors and buying themselves influence and buying themselves laws, deregulation or whatever, but they are becoming the actor itself. And today we increasingly see this different configuration. Today we see the transformation of what's happening. And figures like Musk combine several forms of powers at once. And I think this is such an important thing to note. Enormous economic resources. We're seeing a sort of wealth concentration we have never seen before. But also controls over communication infrastructure, which is a different kind of power. We see technological authority, cultural influence. I think this is also very important to note, that it's not just some anonymous business leader, but Elon Musk becoming a cultural figure in itself. And of course, Elon Musk becoming sort of a state leader, or this combination of all of these things. And the result is a form of private political power that does not need the traditional channels of democratic meditation. Doesn't even need the traditional channels of how businesses need to be some sort of democratic within, but it's because Elon Musk, as a person, as a leader of business, of the state, can hold all this power in just one figure. And this is why Elon Musk cannot simply be understood as a CEO who occasionally intervenes in politics. He is a political actor in his own right. And he's not just a political actor for the US, but he is a global political actor. So he's not just intervening in US politics because it collides with his business interests, but he's also intervening in democracies in Europe and elsewhere. And he is, and I think that's important to note, intervening in the electoral process of states. We saw it in Romania, we saw it in UK, we saw it in Germany. We will probably see it in Hungary, in France, and elsewhere. And another aspect that I think your book captures really well is the ideological ecosystem of Silicon Valley. I think it's so important that you said, well, they're not libertarians, because it's so tempting to say, well, these are the libertarians, because they're not. They don't want to destroy the state, as you said. They want to fuse with the state. And it's not apolitical. It's not some sort of combination of innovation, disruption, technological process, and all these fancy words. But in reality, they carry a very strong political imagination, one that distrusts institutions, at least the institutions that are there, democratic institutions, republican institutions. They celebrate, it's interesting, they celebrate radical individualism, and at the same time they adhere to this idea of cultural collectivism, of being threatened by minorities, of very openly being white supremacist and misogynist. And they frame democratic regulation as an obstacle to this progress. What we're seeing now is that this ideology can connect very easily with the contemporary radical right, and I would argue with contemporary fascism. And not necessarily because the actors started from the same place, some actually do, but because they share several core narratives: hostility toward democratic institutions, contempt for bureaucratic governance, and the idea that society should be reorganized by decisive individual rather than collective processes. In this sense, Musk is not an anomaly. He's a very visible expression of a broader political shift. And this raises an important question. How should democracies respond when private actors accumulate this level of structural power? Because Musk's influence does not only come from wealth. It comes from control over infrastructures that have become central to politics itself: communication platforms, satellite systems, technological ecosystems, even means of war. The challenge, therefore, is not to simply regulating a company or criticizing a billionaire. It is understanding how democratic systems can deal with concentrations of power and of wealth that operate simultaneously in the economic, technological, and political spheres. So perhaps the most important contribution of this book is precisely that it encourages us to look beyond Musk as a person and to examine the political economy that made a figure like him possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natascha. Thank you for your thoughts. Before we delve into the political, economical side, I would like to stick to the cultural influence. And you mentioned one quote by Musk in your book: "Who controls the memes controls the universe." Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that, what he means by that, and if you agree that this is true to some extent?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think this belongs to what we describe as Musk's cyborg turn, which I think Quinn sketched out for all of you, which is our way of trying to understand the broader context for Musk's turn to the right, that he really sees it as a way to reprogram the body politic in order to purge society of the woke mind virus through the creation of a anti-woke mind virus. And I think this is where memes come into play, because memes, the modern internet meme is a joke, right? It's supposed to be funny, it's supposed to be silly, it's supposed to be worthless. The ephemerality of it is, in fact, paradoxically, its value. And this is a quality that Musk attaches onto very early in his journey as a Twitter super user. It's really the mid to late 2010s that Musk starts posting more and more obsessively on social media, embraces memes, embraces meme coins like Dogecoin. But I think particularly for his later development, the meme becomes politicized. It's not just about having laughs with friends online. It's not just about moving financial markets. I think Quinn referred to that a moment ago with the comparison to Henry Ford. Ford couldn't wake up at 2 a.m. in his boxers and post and move markets, right? Musk can, and that's really how he learns the financial value of becoming ever more integrated with the feedback loops of Twitter. But I think we could also say that for Musk, memes serve a political function because they are part of the means by which you can reprogram the computers of society. If you take an entirely digitized view of human reality, the state is a set of computers, society is a set of computers, and most people are programmable. You may have heard the term non-player character from video games. This is a term that Musk uses quite frequently, and we make the case that we should take his use of it quite seriously. In video games, an NPC is a piece of software, a character you would interact with in a gaming world who is not a human being, right? Who's actually an artifact of code. And if you come to understand many, if not most people as NPCs, it follows that many, if not most people, can be programmed. It's actually an engineering solution. And memes and the automation of anti-woke memes of the kind that Grok makes possible is actually part of his political vision. Now, I think for those of us who think about the public sphere, about deliberation, about making an argument that has some appeal to rationality, that places ourselves in a particular political tradition and so forth, this is a very foreign way of thinking. But it's, again, to make the point of Muskism beyond Musk, it's actually a way of thinking that's quite common within the Silicon Valley leadership class because it's a very engineering model of how you do politics.
Yeah, I think one of our approaches in the book was to try not to strictly only pathologize Musk, but to sort of ask, what conditions make it possible for him to have these kind of outrageous beliefs and to be rewarded for having such outrageous beliefs. So we toyed at some point with describing this as hysterical materialism, because it seems that his intuition, which is, as he puts it many times, the most ironic outcome is the most likely, does seem to be validated by the world's capital markets for him again and again and again, right? He is getting external affirmation of his own ability to take the absurd and turn it into concrete value, right? To expand his net worth, to expand the value of his companies. So when he's talking about what we talk about as kind of mimetic determinism, the idea that memes create politics, or his belief that all politics is viruses, on one level that sounds juvenile and stupid, but recall the discussion around the Cambridge Analytica scandal, or the Brexit vote, or indeed the first Trump victory. The explanation that down the line mainstream liberals had for why that happened was basically the right wing bought the algorithm and infected people's minds with, you must say, like a Trump mind virus that allowed them then to vote against their own self-interest. I mean, the mainstream common sense about how the digital public sphere operates is actually not a million miles from the idea that he who controls the memes control the universe, to use, Musk's jokey appropriation of the reference to Dune. So I think it's always worth pointing that out, and also to draw attention to something that I think that Natascha pointed out very well in her insightful remarks here, which is about the nature of our dependency on people like him. I mean, it's a clear illustration of that to say, you can't launch a satellite without putting it inside of the nose of a Falcon 9 rocket. But we want to draw attention to other ways that the world has become dependent on Musk. And if you think, for example, about the top 10 investors in Tesla, it's not a bunch of like-minded freaks that he shares memes with. It's things like the Norwegian Oil Fund. It is things like Vanguard, Fidelity, BlackRock. They're the big institutional investors that, for the most part, are holding the retirement savings of the American middle class, and in some cases, the European middle class. And they are implicitly also approving of Musk's hysterical materialism, right? They may not like that if asked, but the actions of investment, holding Tesla's stock, is saying at some level, we trust you, and we are not just dependent on you for getting our satellites up, but we're dependent on you for our life futures, after retirement, and the well-being of the welfare state in a place like Norway. And that's the kind of sort of head-spinning strangeness, I think, that we are trying to help to get to the heart of in this book.
You're describing his relationship to the state, contrary to the libertarians, to be a symbiosis of a symbiotic nature. And that always means interdependence, that both of them are dependent on each other. And Elon Musk often presents himself as a rogue innovator fighting against government bureaucracy and, chainsaw and so on and so forth. However, you argue that his wealth, his technological and economic empire was actually built in symbiosis. Can you explain a little bit more how state funding, subsidies, infrastructure, and so on were the actual launch pads for companies like SpaceX and Tesla? And why is this not a bigger part of this whole story?
So I think we could maybe examine the case of SpaceX with a bit more detail, because I think it's very clarifying for the kind of themes we've been discussing thus far at a higher level of abstraction. SpaceX is founded in 2002, and this is the first year of the war on terror, right, following the September 11th attacks. Donald Rumsfeld is defense secretary, and Rumsfeld comes into the Pentagon even before the 9/11 attacks with a very particular vision of how he wants to radically reform the Pentagon bureaucracy. And this consists broadly of two themes. One is the modernization of the military from an old-style Cold War era centralized bureaucratic model to one that draws inspiration from Silicon Valley, that's more agile, that's more networked, that's more responsive, that can move in a much more nimble way, and that relies more heavily on high technology to do so. But the means by which this transformation will be accomplished is by deepening the military's reliance on private firms. So the war on terror is a period where the US security state is being expanded at a quite accelerated rate, but it's also being privatized. These are the years of Blackwater, which you may remember, the private military company, which is operating in countries like Iraq with the kind of powers and discretion that would be formerly reserved for a sovereign entity. Right? There's a delegation of sovereignty that occurs. You may also recall that Edward Snowden, the famous whistleblower, was not a direct employee of the National Security Agency, but in fact worked for a company, Booz Allen Hamilton, which was contracting with the NSA to provide analysis services. So in our view, this is the history we tell in the third chapter of the book, Musk identifies a market opportunity, another frontier of state symbiosis that he can access. And in particular, he targets the market for low-cost, small-scale satellites. Because if you return to this Rumsfeld vision for a moment of what defense intellectuals by then had already been talking about as network-centric warfare, what you need to fight terror across the globe, and to do so in a maximally agile way, is a network of satellites that encase the globe that are providing surveillance, reconnaissance, and communications. The 1990s and the 2000s are really the turning point for the role of satellites in warfare. The Gulf War is the first time that the US military uses satellite-guided munitions, but the use of satellites in both guidance and battlefield communications really explodes in the Iraq War in 2003. So Musk secures a series of Pentagon contracts in the early years of SpaceX, which really enable him to make the company viable, and continues on to become a major provider, not just to the Pentagon, but to civilian agencies like NASA. So that's, I think, one very concrete case in which you can see this theme of state symbiosis operating.
I mean, it is really one of the points of the book, I think, is to see Elon Musk as a child of the warfare state. And it's, in a way, the most common gesture in the history of computers, the history of Silicon Valley, to begin by saying, they claim that they live outside the state and they're trying to escape the state out in the West, but the internet itself was created by the state, GPS was created by the state, many of the contracts that continue to exist are created by the state and the government. So we wanted to go slightly beyond that, which by now, for insiders is not exactly a surprise, right, to realize that the level of research and development funding necessary for these large products was almost always coming from the government, and specifically ARPA and the Department of Defense. But we wanted to point out less obvious ways, so I think that the moment that Ben is describing is really a fascinating moment where Musk rushes in and says, I've got the solution for you. A less obvious one is the fact that Tesla as a company is also saved by the state for national security reasons. That might not seem very intuitive, but in 2008, the global financial crisis bankrupts the auto companies, and the war in Iraq is going terribly. Barack Obama and many, many other people, including Republicans, think that for America to get out of foreign wars, to become less dependent on overseas military bases, it needs to electrify the grid and electrify the auto sector. So EVs are going to be objects of national security protection, actually. And this is something that even the Republicans are supporting. So Tesla, even though it's only made a handful of cars, it's making $100,000 sedans for like rich people in California, nevertheless gets a big subsidy from the state because there was this vision of electric autonomy, as we described, being actually the horizon for American national security. Why does that sound strange now? Because literally 2 or 3 years later, the shale revolution takes place. And through the fracking technology now, America goes from being a net importer of petroleum to a net exporter of petroleum. And everyone forgets about the idea of electric autonomy as a national security concern. Some of them might be thinking about it again right now. But the other origin of that, or other element of Musk's fortune that gets inserted at that time is the California zero emission vehicle credits, which until they were abruptly ended under the Trump administration accounted for 40% of the revenue of Tesla. Again, from that legacy of electric autonomy equals national security. So the state role that Musk has played up to the present, up to this week, when Grok technology, for example, is one of the tools being used in the automated targeting and destruction of sites in Iran, up to the use of those same Starlink satellites to help orient that, up to the creation of the Golden Dome system, which is the grand strategy for American missile defense, which relies heavily on Musk's products at almost every stage of the way. We can see that Musk can actually sacrifice the consumer market, arguably, in certain ways. In a way, it doesn't matter if liberals hate him now. If he can plug completely into state dependency, then that can actually perhaps be the lifeline that will also help them pave the way towards AI creation that they hope will launch us to a computer-aided future.
But what does it mean if a single private citizen actually can withdraw or grant sovereignty as a service to nation states? What does it mean for the nation states themselves, for democracies?
Can I just, because I want to say, comment on something Ben said earlier, because I think it's really important. You said it in your presentation, the shift that happened around 2020, the pandemic, this whole talk about the mind virus. Of course, the image we have is a computer virus, but also, of course, virus is also a biological reality. And he leans very heavily in this sort of body politics, biological language. And if we add NPCs to this equation, which is, of course, again, computer language, gaming language, NPCs are sort of non-actors. They're just there to elevate the main character, and the main character is the only thing that counts. So NPCs are disposable in the end. If you kill off NPCs, it doesn't matter. If you kill off the main character, it matters because it's game over. And what we're seeing here is something we also saw in the historical fascism, the use of technological language, the use of biological language, intertwining these two to create people who matter and people who don't matter, people who can be killed off and people who by all means have this challenge and have this have to get to the next level if you use gaming language, because they are the chosen ones. So what we are seeing is, and I would argue that it's a fascist shift we see in the ideology, which may be not very consistent, but at least in the language we see Musk uses. And I think it's very important to connect these things with all these things you said, that it is very much a fascist reality Musk describes when he talks about NPCs, when he talks about killing off viruses, when he talks about people who are disposable and people who should be targeted through his technology.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the line of interpretation, definitely, because it's not just a question of people who don't matter, it's a question of people whose presence is poisonous to the well-being of the people who do matter. So they can't be simply ignored or neglected, they actually need to be actively removed. And this is really symptomatic of the limits of the Muskist mentality when brought to the problem of governance. Because when he was carrying out the Doge initiative, the whole goal, as he saw it, was to find the vampires in the system, to find the zombies in the system, and the fake people and shadow people in the system who were either taking state money without legitimately being allowed to, or they were being more likely flown illegally into the country to vote for the Democrats who were utilizing them as pawns in a kind of a political game. So any kind of resistance or dissent from his political vision was interpreted actually as simply an invasion of non-people who had contaminated the smooth functioning of the machine that he was trying to build, right? It's actually, so one thing he cannot hold in his head is the idea of sort of competing visions of the good life or competing visions of society that might, involve compromises or trade-offs, but then perhaps theoretically a middle ground could be found. In other words, the long, painful history of civil society and democratic deliberation is something I think simply does not scan for him. So the terms that you're describing in, however, is very natural for him.
I wonder if we could dwell on the comparison with classical fascism for a moment, because it's quite, I think, a generative line of thinking, and one that I think Quinn and I actually haven't done very much of, and it's kind of interesting to think about it with you, Natascha. And I want to bring it back to something you said in your opening remarks, which is the question of the relationship between the economy and politics. Because one of the ways to understand the experience of classical fascism is that in the face of a threat from the left, a political formation was constructed that was able to stabilize capitalism of a sort, but at the cost of negotiating a new boundary between the economy and politics, which was not precisely the boundary that existed before. I think these days there's much discussion of the dissolution of that boundary through digital technology, and this is part of how people come up with terms like techno-feudalism, which is perhaps a term that many of the people in this room have heard as elaborated by thinkers like Yanis Varoufakis and Cédric Durand. And while there are various ways to define that development, I think a through line is the notion that through digitization, this relationship between public and private, between the economic and the political, is being renegotiated. Frank Pascal, an American legal scholar, has a term that Quinn and I have found quite helpful, which is that of functional sovereignty. Frank's argument is that many of these large tech firms who have such extraordinary power, not just within the United States, but globally, can be understood to be functionally sovereign entities. That if you think about the types of decisions that a company like Facebook might make about how to moderate content or not across the many countries around the world in which it operates, these are the types of decisions that historically would have been made by a government entity, right? And it can have quite massive political repercussions. So I wonder if we could, kind of use Muskism to find another vantage point on that question, that rather than reaching for the kind of feudal analogy which is an attempt to think about this in pre-capitalist terms, where you don't have a capitalist social relation, you have a more personalized and directly political, so-called extra-economic relationship of just coercion and extraction between the feudal lord and the serf. That I think Muskism, our hope is that it actually gives us a way to think about the renegotiation of that boundary in terms that are in fact more specifically capitalist, but also more modern and modernizing. Because I think the promise of state symbiosis, why Musk is seeking this integration of public and private power, of digital and political power, is that he is promising a particular kind of future. It's not a feudal vision that he's promising. He's promising states that they will have a bright future by hardening borders, by garrisoning their population or a particular part of their population against external threats.
I think it's very interesting to think along these lines because there is another group that we're not talking about when we talk about all of this. There are other parts of capitalism that are sort of, put to the sidelines because different groups, different fractions of capitalists were used to have this access to power because that's how neoliberalism worked. You pay for it and you get deregulation, you get the laws you want. But now it's tech capital that basically calling the shots and calling all of it. So what is also happening is this sort of infight within the capitalist class, that parts of the capitalists that used to have a direct access to power are renegotiated to NPCs at the end. And I think we see how Musk puts himself as this sort of renegade outsider when he talks about all these other groups and fractions of capitalism. That's exactly his vision of it. So the future is not, it's a techno-capitalist future. And other parts of the capitalist class are not in the lead of that. And I think it's also very important to note that.
Well, I think the historical parallel is also helpful because it begs the question of, who is in the driver's seat, basically, right? I mean, historically, we know that the capitalists in some cases turned to the more disorganized, militant, grassroots-generated social movement that was fascism in the feeling that they could co-opt it and use it to their own ends, and they found that they were mistaken. So the question of whether big tech is finding itself in a similar relationship to the MAGA movement, I think, is very much posed by us actually in that last chapter that we call State Acts. Because the outcome of the Doge initiative could look like a validation of the idea that in the end, old-fashioned political authorities are still the ones who are able to call the shots, that are still the ones who are guiding the process, and Musk had to sort of leave with his tail between his legs. But if you look at this latest action of the expression of sovereign military power underway right now in over the Straits of Hormuz and into Iran, then you see that actually the very technologies that were introduced into the state in the course of the Doge initiative are now the ones being used to exercise this power, and in ways that will create a feedback loop of demand for the very products that tech capital itself is specialized in producing. So they're actually now arguably kind of wagging the dog by creating infinite demand for actually the services that are most profitable for them. So this is absolutely, I think, probably the prime political question of the moment in the United States, which is this tech sector able to kind of manipulate the White House to make its own kind of AI investments possible, while perhaps even either softening or accelerating the more punitive, restrictionist, anti-immigrant parts of the political demands? Or will they find themselves just instrumentalized by the shifting impulses and whims of a very unpredictable White House? And in both cases, looking back to the history of the 1930s becomes actually quite a helpful, instructive case.
Before we go further into that question, I would like to open the floor also to the audience. If you have questions, I kindly ask you to raise your hands. And as I see quite a lot of hands, I would kindly ask you to be brief and concise. I will start in the front, and please wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading this book. My question is about Trump. About Musk? Do you think he is going to stay relevant in the medium term if the United States are going to have another free and fair elections? So if Trump is voted out of office, I believe Musk himself said he expects to go to jail then. So is he going to stay relevant in that case? Also considering that he was promising the fully autonomous car for 20 years. Now he gave up on that, and he's selling the next product that's 20 or more years out of reach. So will people at some point notice that he's selling vaporware?
Okay, thank you.
Maybe we can just answer that very quickly, because just rather
Yes,
than
and Michi,
getting
you could
lost
go
in
to
the
the
collection
other
of
side.
other ones. So we started off Ben started us off by talking about the parallel to Fordism, right? And the way that the French regulation school helpfully thought about Fordism is it's not just a form of production, but it's also a kind of social compromise and a social contract. So one of our guiding questions is like, where is the social contract of Muskism? Is it adequate to the task of stabilizing the disruptive effects of the technologies that his accumulation model requires? And the only answer that you can really rely on, other than his attention online, is the same one that worked under post-Fordism, which is asset price inflation. So what I referred to before with the really now structural reliance of the American political economy, especially after the IPO of SpaceX later this year, on the well-being of Musk's companies, then for a Democrat to come in and deliberately target Musk in a way that might undercut Tesla would be tantamount to kind of courting recessionary tendencies. I think the fall of Musk's empire at this point is getting close to like the fall of one of the big investment banks in 2008. So arguably the Democrats are as handcuffed to Muskism as it stands right now as the Republicans are. I'd like to think otherwise, but it seems that that's...
Compared to AT&T in the 80s?
Well, we'll see, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. My question relates to why this is happening now, and I think you showed very well that it goes back to this idea in South Africa of fortification, and I was thinking about so fortification against who are we defending against, and for me it led to the idea of dominance, dominating somebody else, achieving authority, and ultimately the question for me was what is hiding underneath these tendencies, right? And for me, the question is this just insecurity at the end of the day? Because reading your book about Hayek's bastards, for me, it was just like, yeah, ultimately we have to bring in some natural dimension of it because that's justifiable. That's how we can justify our superiority at the end of the day.
Okay. So also the question, what's the end game? Genau. Sorry. Yep.
Gleich anschließend die Frage. My question would be, you picture Musk as a king on the cover of the book. What is all this talking about kings about? I mean, is this just a right-wing strategy to sell totalitarianism? Because speaking of a king sounds more like fairy tales than like talking about fascism. I'm hearing that people in the Silicon Valley also dream of Caesarism, and Curtis Yarvin dreamed of J.D. Vance as a king. So what is all this king metaphors about? Is there a monarchist aspect in Muskism? Yeah, that's the question.
Thank you. I think we will, in the third row.
Thanks. I have a political economy question because you mentioned at the beginning that the model of Musk was this kind of vertical integration where he sourced all his inputs very locally. But on the other hand, we know that he became incredibly rich by reaping global monopoly rents. And as we have heard from Natascha Strobl, now Musk is supporting the very nationalist right-wing parties all over Europe and the rest of the world. And these parties actually are trying to set up borders again, which would actually inhibit the reaping of these monopoly rents, at least on a global scale. So in a way, isn't he destroying his own business model?
So we'll stop here, and then we'll take a second round of questions.
Okay, maybe I'll try to take one or two of these. Yeah, maybe I'll do Technoking. So you may already be familiar that Musk, in 2021, I believe, retitles himself at Tesla from CEO to Technoking, which I think is the inspiration for this image. I think there's two ways to understand that term. I think one is this fusion of digital and political power that we spoke about just a moment ago. If you conceive of society as a whole and the state in particular as a bunch of computers, then the way that you exercise power of any kind, including political power, is by seizing control of these computers and reprogramming the code base. And this is essentially what Doge attempts to do. The first thing that Doge operatives would do when they enter a new federal agency in 2025 during that initiative was to identify the information technology systems and to take control of them. There was even an effort at the Department of the Treasury's Bureau of Fiscal Service to build a so-called delete button that could cut off funding at the source of any agency or program they liked. So this is quite a literal view of the state as a code base, that rather than relying on Congress to pass appropriations bills about what the federal government will fund, and then have the executive branch implement those funding decisions, which is how it's supposed to work under the Constitution, you rather have a small set of engineers who are deleting contracts, deleting funding. And that is a way of doing policy that does not rely on human intermediaries who might be unreliable. It also does not rely on democratic deliberation of any kind. It short circuits it, it bypasses it. So that's one way to understand a kind of expression of techno-monarchy, if you like. Another is by reference to the work of Peter Thiel. And if you're familiar with Thiel's book, 0 to 1, it's actually a quite elegant summary of Silicon Valley thinking. It's one that Musk provides an admiring blurb for. And in that book, Thiel elaborates the notion that a perfect startup actually resembles a monarchy because you have an empowered founder king who can act decisively and implement his decisions rapidly. So in order to achieve such an organizational structure, you have to cut out the middle layer of bureaucracy. You have to cut out any mediation between the leader and the workers, right? And this is in fact how Musk prefers to structure his companies. He talks about the signal-to-noise ratio between engineers and managers, right? Minimize middle management, cut them out, automate them away as much as possible so that Musk can implement his imperatives from on high and have them realized by the masses of workers. So that anti-bureaucratic impulse is also another way, I think, to understand that techno-monarchy idea.
In response to the third question, I think I would answer that in two ways. One would be to point to the way that the gigafactories were built in the 2010s and early 2020s. They were sold basically as kind of modular nationalism, right? So he was able to sell Tesla as a brand to China to allow China to build out its own electric vehicle sector. So it's critically, the bodies of the car were being built there, the brand was there, the technology was there, but the lithium-ion batteries were coming from a relatively new company called CATL It was a Chinese battery supplier that now, if you know, dominates the global market for lithium-ion batteries. So he could sell, even at a time of relatively still robust globalization, a more self-contained, economically nationalist product to China, the same way that then he could turn around and sell it to Germany and the EU with a gigafactory in Brandenburg as a way to fulfill their own political goals of just energy transition, of more self-sufficiency in the auto sector. So he prefigured in our argument the move towards more deglobalization, hardening borders, closing, not in the sense that he chose one nation and said all the other nations are evil, but he made his services available to, as a sovereignty, as a service, to any of the new nationalist undertakings that might be interested. So in that sense, I don't think AFD governed Germany and Brothers of Italy governed Italy could be mutually incompatible with the model that he's already pioneered. I think he could easily be selling the factories for his products to these three places. The problem is, do you overstep the demands for sovereigntism that those far-right parties have made their reputation on by showing too openly your support for them? As we know, all of the far-right parties in Europe, almost to a single one, are keeping arm's length basically from the influence of Musk, because he can undercut the legitimacy of a party that is claiming to speak on the behalf of its people alone. So I think that's one of the places where Musk doesn't understand politics. He assumes, I'm giving you money, I'm giving you meme support. Of course you're profiting, of course you want this. And when people like Nigel Farage and even Bardella and Le Pen say, we're not sure if we want that, he's like, but I'm giving you the memes, and memes control the universe. He doesn't understand the idea of legitimacy, so it doesn't scan for him. But I think as a business model, I don't think it's necessarily inconsistent. More importantly now for the growth horizons of his business prospects is a new monopoly, which is the monopoly of low Earth orbit space. So that is the land grab, space grab that he's attempting right now by making that request to scale up from 10,000 to 1 million, at which point the valuation reflects the impression that he will have then a global telecommunications monopoly and be able to speak to everyone's handset and everyone's device here on Earth. So that's a way to kind of deterritorialize the monopoly problem, which at least has enough of a prospect that they've valued the company right now at $1.25 trillion, a significant amount more than any of the other privately held companies, which it's worth noting for a moment, he doesn't want to go public. He doesn't like being a publicly traded company. It disrupts the monarchy feature of private corporate governance. When you're a public company, you're subject to reporting requirements. You are open to shareholder activism, shareholder initiatives that have, in the past, disrupted his intentions at Tesla, at least created bumps in the road. He's doing this out of an act of desperation. He needs to do a huge capital raise to try to burst out ahead of his competitors in the AI sector. So he's swallowing the bitter pill and subjecting himself to corporate governance, which he would actually rather not do. Very briefly to the first question, I feel like it's also posing again in a way this question of the social contract. And it's a question of, you said fortification against who, but if you look at something else that reflects Muskism, we think, is Alexander Karp's book, The Technological Republic, which similarly is kind of trying to sell tech dominance in an era of increasing precariousness, increasing public anxiety about the effects of automation and AI, and an era of, as we know, still galloping inequality and the K-shaped recovery after the recession, and people's feeling that growth is something that is, coming along with increasing social disruption, increasing climate crisis, and so on. So how do you sell the continued dominance of tech when people look around and say, I'm not sure if the world is getting better ever since Silicon Valley has been in charge of the American economy? Well, you tell them that without them, the world would be much more dangerous. And not just that, but without them, the world would kill you. So if you flip through the pages of Technological Republic or scroll through Musk's tweets, occasionally he'll try out something like amazing abundance, which is like, that's a really low effort slogan, right? I mean, that's not really innovating much. But more often he's saying, the streets are filled with immigrants, there are enemies at the gates, you are in great danger, and if you don't use our products and our services, the barbarians will enter the fortress. That's the story of Alexander Karp. And that's the story of Musk. And it's a very pessimistic version of the social contract. It's not about future prosperity. It's not about growth. It's certainly not about self-determination or sovereignty or democracy in those old-fashioned ways. To call it a republic is itself kind of strange. It actually sounds a little bit more like the technological kingdom.
I have a follow-up question for you,
Yes,
Natascha,
I know.
because you mentioned the complicated relations the relationship between Musk and the European far right, and maybe you could tell us a little bit
Yes.
more about this complicated relationship. And you didn't mention it, but it's obviously a big part of the whole story, the great replacement narrative, his pro-natalist views, white supremacist views. How does this all fit together?
Well, I think there's one other thing Musk didn't think of, and that's how the European far right works differently than the alt-right in the US. So there's the whole new right, Nouvelle Droite, and parts of it are very positive towards the alt-right, but towards the alt-right. But there's a sort of right-wing extremism in Europe that's not very keen on the US, and it doesn't matter what comes out of the US. They're very anti-US, and there's a sort of anti-Americanism deeply ingrained in a lot of European societies that Musk doesn't know of, and is puzzled why he's not welcomed with open arms. And we don't have to think that's a good thing, but it sort of stops this relationship between the far right and why they're not welcoming Musk with the open arms he's welcomed with in the US, because he's still seen as the US, and there's this psychological barrier in many of far-right parties and also in European societies that prevents this relationship. And there also, I'm not going too deeply into it, but it's something that's very, very close to what I'm working at the moment, is the sort of relationship between monarchy and fascism. Because it sort of shouldn't work together. And historically, they were very much at odds with each other, but not everywhere. So if we think about National Socialism and if we think about Italian fascism, we know how this very precarious relationship worked. But there were sorts of fascist projects that tried to intertwine these two aspects. And one of the very prominent ones was Austrofascism. So Austrofascism tried to stabilize itself by bringing back the emperor. It didn't work, and we know it didn't work, and we know they were overtaken by National Socialism at the end. But they tried, and they also ideologically tried to intertwine fascism with the monarchy. Because why is this image so important for the far right, especially in the US? First of all, it's a taboo. The American Republic, founded as an anti-monarchist project, to bring back monarchy is a taboo. And it promises grandeur, it promises megalomania, but it also promises permanence. And permanence is something fascism is deeply obsessed with, because it's a death cult in the end. And they're obsessed with their legacy. And their legacy can only be preserved if someone preserves it. And they have to find what comes after the leader, what comes after them, and what's more permanent than monarchy. And I think also this sort of kitsch nostalgia images that fascism always has. But I think the most important aspect of why they're bringing back monarchy is their self-promise of permanence, and that there's something grander than the dire present we're living now. And that's a very, very fascist promise they're giving us with this image of monarchy, ironically.
Okay, thank you. I promised a second round of questions. Please raise your hands. Okay, let's start in the back now. Sorry, Michi. Please raise your hands so we can see you. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to zoom out for a second from Tesla specifically, and because these technological interdependencies that you talked about, these also pertain between, for example, Amazon and different states or Microsoft, and these have also been weaponized already, like some months back, I think, when a judge in Den Haag was locked out of her, I think, Teams account and all kinds of Microsoft account. So I guess one natural question to ask is how can we start to alleviate these dependencies, if there is even a way at the moment?
Thank you. Please raise your hands. I can see them. Over there.
I think, thank you for the enlightening analysis. I have a similar question, I think. So my question is, how should European governments and the European Union effectively counter Muskism? And right now, governments are trying to reach more digital sovereignty, which is essentially also buying into the narrative of autonomy. And do you see this as the right way to tackle Muskism?
Thank you. And I saw another one in the... Yes, please.
Thanks to the panel, I'm beginning to understand Musk. What I don't understand is our role. With the left is excellent at analyzing with hindsight what is going on, but I don't see any effective political action to bring around a change. Labour votes all over the planet are going down the drain. Many theories about that. I'd be interested in your opinion.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to start?
And I can take a couple of those. So I think there's a pedagogical shock quality to how far Musk has gone in recent months, right? I mean, there has to be a red line somewhere, and I think for some European states, the moment at which he turned his AI chatbot into a child sexual abuse material generator was one of those moments. He did that in early 2026 with an express desire to juice the user base on the platform. And over the course of the few weeks that was able to be done, you could nudify any image that you wanted. Tens of thousands of images were created non-consensually, of course. And this was a very cynical desire to make the app seem more popular ahead of its merger with XAI, which in itself is ahead of its merger with SpaceX for the IPO that I alluded to earlier. That being such a shocking transgression of, everyday morality, not to mention many laws, led the Parisian Attorney General, for example, the prosecutor, to finally raid the X offices, as they'd been planning to do for a year a few weeks ago. It led the UK to open up investigation into X for algorithmic manipulation and spread of sexual material, and it also led the Spanish Prime Minister to speak out hostilely and directly against Musk, leading to a big backlash from Musk himself. If Musk is on his feed wasting his time targeting you, then you must be doing something right. And there is, I think, a possibility now that the awareness of digital dependency for Europe, as gestured to more broadly, will start to become more pressing as a political matter. It's simply the case that 90% of the operations that happen inside of a given office building in Austria or anywhere else in the EU is being done through Silicon Valley's products. Cloud storage, email, search, messaging, video conferencing. All of this is happening, the basic functioning of society are happening through the platforms provided by American firms, owned in almost all cases by people who were happy to line up behind Trump on the dais at inauguration. So Musk, in that sense, is only one of the more grotesque manifestations of a general phenomenon. So it seems like the EU there has two possibilities, right? There's either regulation or replacement. You either do what the EU has already done, the kind of stuff that Anu Bradford and others describe, taking the rules-based approach, Digital Services Act, GDPR, annoying the tech giants and platform giants with all of the things that they are not allowed to do. Or you take the route of replacement, right? I was recently doing a video conference with someone related to the French government, and they no longer use Microsoft Teams now. It's through a French-owned and based platform. And there are ways that to, over time, displace what has been a monopoly decades in the making. It's not an overnight process. But examples are in the press almost every day. Just yesterday, there was a news story about a new Spanish rocket company, which is setting up in French Guiana as a kind of replacement to SpaceX. The third biggest container ship company in the world out of France will start to use Usatel this year instead of Starlink, hoping that it can serve the same function that Musk's products have. So I think it's not quite a lost fight. To very quickly to the question of what can the left do or what have they done, one of my fellow professors at Boston University, who herself is a kind of critical communications scholar, started what was called the Tesla takedown movement last year, which led to protests at Tesla dealerships all over the country, helped to crystallize and focus people's anger at Musk as both a political actor and as a corporate actor, and played some role, I think, in bringing down the sales numbers of his company, which, as we know, like with Trump, the market is the only thing that matters to him in the end. And when it speaks back to him, then he listens. So that, in a banal way, there is the power of consumer activism. Obviously, the kind of stuff that hopefully Ben can say something more about as someone involved in this. There's also the side of organized labor within tech firms, which is not a small issue for the people that we're describing.
Yeah, maybe I'll speak just briefly to the question of how Europe might counter their dependence on not just Musk's platforms, but of course on Silicon Valley more broadly. And I think, as you alluded to, the matter of digital sovereignty has become, I think, increasingly urgent among European policymakers in the second Trump administration. I think I would sound a cautionary note here, which is that Musk, among many others, is very familiar in selling the promise of sovereignty. So one of the terms you may have heard is sovereign AI. This is something that the head of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, sells to nation states all around the world, where he'll come and say, I know you want to build your own national AI project and sector, let me help, right? And this is, in fact, a kind of classic Muskist dynamic of the sort we describe in the book, which is we promise to increase state capacity, to give you access to these technologies of the future that you can use for national security, that you can use for economic development and so forth. But the cost of doing so is to increase your dependency on us as a private provider based in the United States. So sovereignty and dependency always have this dialectic interrelation in Muskism, but I think you can see Huang's sovereign AI sales pitch as participating in that. That, I think, should make Europeans feel a bit of caution around the term sovereignty. What kind of sovereignty, right? And further, is it enough to simply replace, let's say, Facebook or Gmail or whatever with a European clone? Or is it worth thinking a bit more deeply about the kind of values that are embedded into these technologies, right? Is it possible to construct a kind of digital sovereignty in which principles of democracy, of solidarity, are respected and enhanced? And there are some interesting people like Cecilia Recap, Francesca Bria, who are doing important and practical work on that subject, which I encourage people to check out. I think in terms of the sources of political hope, which might give us a stirring way to conclude the conversation. I'm the resident optimist in the duo, if you haven't been able to tell. I can give you a few examples from the situation I know best, which is the American political scene. One is the case of Minneapolis, which you may have followed, which is a situation in which something that looks quite a bit like Muskism in action, which is groups of heavily armed agents of the state using high technology in the form of facial recognition software and databases, going door to door to identify people out of place, to target them for expulsion. This is very consonant with many of the themes that we develop in this book. This incursion is defeated through a popular mobilization of neighborhoods, of communities coming together, using, in fact, technologies of their own, like WhatsApp and Signal groups, to coordinate, doing so in a highly networked and horizontal manner, and managing to engage in acts of mass resistance that impose sufficiently high costs to the federal government to actually really alter the course of that campaign and to contribute to the departure of some key officials and, critically, to shift public opinion. We now have a majority of Americans who are in favor of abolishing ICE, which is the agency responsible for detaining and deporting immigrants. So through popular mobilization, we're actually beginning to build a popular constituency for a different approach to immigration, which is very sorely needed in the United States. The entire political spectrum, including the Democrats, in fact, especially the Democrats, Obama was the so-called deporter-in-chief, has been racing to the right at high speed on the immigration question. If you want to really feel disoriented, go back and read a Ronald Reagan speech about immigration. The way that the right used to talk about immigration sounds like an anarchist today, basically, which is a good thing, by the way. I point to a couple other just brief things, moving quickly. Data centers have become a source of intense popular opposition. These data centers are often built in so-called red states, so rural areas that vote very heavily for the Republican Party. People are flooding town halls. They're enraged. They want to stop the construction of these data centers because they feel it contributes to higher electricity bills, and they're worried about their jobs being automated by AI. So this is a very large political vulnerability for the Republican Party, and in particular for the coalition between Silicon Valley and the Trump administration, that I think much can and will be made use of. And I think maybe just to conclude my remarks with a more general and I think more hopeful note, one of, I think it's fair to say, the factors behind Musk's turn to the right, and indeed the emergence of a new Silicon Valley right, is that it is a response and a reaction to the rise of the new American left, which has emerged over the course of the last decade and a half. When these figures, including Musk, were closer to the Democratic Party, were closer to Obama, there was not a visible American left. There was not a social movement left in the streets. We now have that. We've had years of organizing around banners like Black Lives Matter. We now have Democratic Socialists of America, which is the largest socialist organization in American history. We now have a quite visible and vocal left wing of the Democratic Party, as embodied by the new mayor of New York City, Zoran Mamdani, and other figures like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. And what I think it's fair to characterize this development as is an attempt to forge a new kind of class politics that coheres segments of the population that have historically been atomized from one another, which is on the one hand a new working class that consists of precarious, downwardly mobile young people, college educated for the most part, and immigrant workers of various kinds in various professions, but especially concentrated in service provision and healthcare, and the remnants of the old working class of the Rust Belt regions. So if you look, for instance, at the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2020, it's the template for how to forge a new class politics from those disparate parts. You have baristas in Brooklyn. You have Latina hotel workers in Reno, Nevada. You have machinists in Michigan. And it's possible to bring all of these people into a new politics of solidarity where you're building a common interest across lines of difference, as the labor movement, the socialist movement has always done, but you're doing so in a very new political economic context. And I think that's ultimately my source of social hope, not just as a force capable of defeating Muskism, but really of constructing a future worth inhabiting.
Thank you.
Are you inspired?
Wasn't that inspiring?
What is more to add? I mean, thanks for ending our dystopian conversation on such a positive utopian note. I thank you so much for being with us, so much for accepting our invitation. Danke, Natascha, fürs Mitdiskutieren. Liebes Publikum, danke für die Aufmerksamkeit, fürs aufmerksame Zuhören, für die interessanten Fragen. Wir sind jetzt mit der offiziellen Veranstaltung zu Ende, aber es gibt, wie versprochen, die Möglichkeit, dieses Buch und auch weitere zu kaufen. Und die beiden Autoren sind auch so nett und bleiben noch zum Signieren hier. Sie finden den Raum drüben im Seminarraum. Am Weg dorthin gibt es auch noch ein paar Erfrischungen, falls Sie durstig oder hungrig sind. Auf jeden Fall freuen wir uns, wenn Sie uns wieder beehren hier im Renninstitut. Herzlichen Dank fürs Kommen und schönen Abend.